and welcome to another episode of Our Own Devices with Nandagopal Rajan. No prizes for guessing that this is Nandagopal Rajan again in front of you. But with us this time is a very interesting guest, and this is also going to be a very interesting episode because instead of deep diving into a particular kind of technology, a new technology trend, we are going to be going on a slightly philosophical, roller coaster ride this time. And with me is Byron Reese. He's a tech entrepreneur. He's done a lot of things, but when you do a lot of things, it means you have a lot of knowledge and you want to pass it on. And that's why he's also a very acclaimed author in the space of, how do I put it, technology and the future. And his latest book, Stories, Dice, and Rocks That Think, that's just out in the US and we should be getting it in India anytime soon. So, Byron, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Byron, can I just start by asking you about the name of the book, right? The Stories, Dice, and Rocks That Think. Can you sort of elaborate what's behind the book and what's behind the name?
The book began as I was curious about a simple question, which is how are people and animals different? Because people always want to say, oh, we're just another animal. But when you look around at our cities and our literature and our history and all of that, we sure seem a lot different. I mean, to animals, we must look like aliens. We're that different. But I wondered why. And and I tell that story in three acts, as I call them. It's a story, so it gets three acts. And the first one's called Stories. And it's about how we learn to imagine the future. And then we weren't content to just be able to imagine the future. And that brings us to the second act, Dice. And that's when we invented probability because we wanted to learn how to see the future. We wanted to predict the future, not just imagine it, but predict it. And that was the dice, the probability. And then finally, Rocks That Think. It's a metaphor for a silicon computer chip. It's a rock that doesn't really think, but it almost thinks. And that's how Act 3 is about how we took that science of probability and we instantiated it into our computers so we could do it at much more scale than we had ever imagined doing it ourselves. That's the third act. It's about the future, about what's going to happen with these machines.
So, I'm visualizing a caveman somewhere, lying on his back and gazing at the stars and sort of thinking about the future. Maybe he doesn't know the concept of future, but he's thinking about the future, and that sort of, sets our evolution in motion in a way, right? Am I too far off by thinking like that?
Well, I used to think like that, but when I got into the book, what I realized is that the archaeological record looks really strange because if you think of something like cave art,
Yeah.
and you were to ask yourself, I wonder what the oldest cave art looks like. I know what I would think. I would think it would be just like crude stick figures, two legs, like a little kid would draw. And then maybe we got a little better at it. Like maybe we put a triangle on one of them for a dress or locks of hair or something. I don't know. And it got better and better slowly. And that's not what happened. What happened is we had none, 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 none. And then it exploded everywhere, and it's the most beautiful stuff you would ever want to look at. You have it in Europe, like in the caves at Chauvet. Maybe you've seen those. They're just beautiful by any standard. But all over Southeast Asia, we found ones that date to the similar period and are similarly artistic. And now what's strange is when you look in those caves and you start excavating in them, you find the very first musical instruments. And you find the very first representations of creatures, like fantastic creatures, like a woman's body with a lion's head or something. And so what it really looks like is we were animals, and then one day something happened, probably to somebody, and in an instant we were us. Because you look at those caves like in Chauvet, it wasn't just that they were beautiful, but they were technically amazing because they had to build scaffolding to paint on the ceiling. And they had to add fat to the pigments to get them to adhere. They had to add talc to them to extend them. And most interestingly, for black, they had charcoal, but it wasn't black enough. And so they would get this mineral from 140 miles away that they would use to make black pigment. So all of a sudden you see creatures that don't look anything like us, or that look like us but don't act like us, and then all of a sudden you see us fully formed. And I think what happened is somehow there was a minor mutation in one person and they got language. And the main purpose of language is not to communicate, strangely enough. The main purpose of language is to think. It's what our thoughts are made out of. And that isn't just speculation on my part. Helen Keller, right, I quoted in the book, Helen Keller has this wonderful passage where she writes about what her life was like before her teacher came. So she was blind, couldn't speak, couldn't hear. And she said before her teacher came, she didn't even realize she was a thing that was different than the universe. Like, she didn't realize it was time. Like, and then she learned language, and with language you could form thoughts in your head. And then she said, then I realized I was something, and I became conscious in that moment. And I think that's what happened to us. And that's all of what Act One is. We got language, which allowed us to believe in two things that don't exist: the future and the past. They don't exist, right? The only thing in the world, the only thing that's real is this moment right here. And the future and past are just made up ideas that we learned how to use. And so those very first people, would imagine the future, just like a minute in the future. They would think, what could I do here? I could go behind the mountain, or I could do this, or I could do that. And that's why we became us.
So, if you think about it, you had somebody, who sharpened a stone and worked on a tool, but he's also thinking of the future, that he's thinking of an eventuality in the future that he has to sort of take on, right? And the tool is going to help him. And this is how we invented a lot of things, right? Like, you have this interesting concept about what you think is the most important invention of humankind.
Well, I mentioned it in a book I'm working on right now. That I mentioned in one sentence. I said the paper.
Yeah.
Paper, I think, is the most important one. And there's a reason for that. So for billions, literally billions of years, the only place that we could write down information, life on this planet could write information, there was one place, and that was in your DNA. And it took tens of thousands of years to write one little thing. And that was it. That was our only way to record information. And then one day we invented language. And when we did that, our DNA was not just what was in our cells, but what we could articulate. So, for instance, it didn't take a million years for somebody to learn not to eat the purple berry. And they eat the purple berry, they get sick, and then they could just say to somebody else, hey, don't eat the purple berries. And then that was it. It was just like a genetic mutation. And that could spread just like a genetic mutation. And that expanded our effective genome, because it wasn't just what was written in our DNA, but it was everything that we could imagine, articulate, and so forth. But then things got really interesting, because there was a man named Leonard Reed who wrote an essay back in the 40s called I, Pencil. And in it, he points out that nobody knows how to make a pencil. There's nobody in the world who could mine the ore and make the iron and smelt it then beat it into steel and then wrap it in the ferrule, and then get the rubber from the tree. And there's nobody who could do all that. And yet pencils get made. And it's like, well, how is that? And so pencils are made because we used to just have our DNA in our cells and it was in our heads. Well, now we write down how to do everything. And that has made the world into kind of a single organism. If you think of a smartphone, if nobody could make a pencil, there's nobody in the world who can make a smartphone, right? Like, your body has 30 elements in it. That smartphone has 60 elements in it. Like, it's harder to make than you. And so what happened? So you then say, well, if nobody knows how to make a smartphone, how do smartphones get made? And they get made, I call it, by a superorganism, I call it agora, which you could just think of as like the collective mental capacity of all humans. And agora knows how to make telephones, make smartphones and pencils and everything else. Even though we don't, it does. And that's why paper's so important, because it became our genome. And just like your own DNA, most of it's junk DNA, right? Doesn't matter. Most of it's like reruns of old TV episodes and all of that. But there's a little bit in there that tells you how to do everything we know how to do.
So is it right to say that every time we think about something, we are thinking about something, we are sort of connecting or downloading from this supercomputer, which is a mix of our past, of our collective learning over millennia, right?
Yeah, yeah, you actually said that a lot better than I did, and much more succinct.
Yeah. We talked a lot about the past, but let's talk a bit about the future. And we have had a bleak few years, but you always have a very positive outlook about the future. So as of now, what is your outlook about the future?
It's positive. I mean, I believe three very simple things that give me an optimistic outlook. I'm not just like optimistic because that's my thing. I'm optimistic because I think I know three things. The first is that there was this period in our past where we got down to like 1,000 people. That was it. Like we were an endangered species, and nobody would have ever bet on us. Nobody would have ever bet on us. But we learned a trick. We call it technology. And technology is the means by which we're able to amplify, multiply what we're able to do. And that was the thing. See, your body runs on about 100 watts of power. That's it. But uh, if you, and then, we learned to harness an ox, and that's another 200 watts of power. But what we have is thousands and thousands of watts of power at our disposal. So we've been able to amplify what we're able to do. And there's no reason to think that we know everything. So I think we can believe our technology is going to get better and better. That's the first thing I believe. Then the second thing I believe is that people are basically good. Now that may not seem to be the case, but it really is. Like the modern world relies on trust. This is a true story. This just happened. I sold something on eBay and I boxed it up and I shipped it to the person. And then they filed a complaint on eBay saying that I just sent them a rock. I mean, I didn't send them a rock. I sent them what they bought. And eBay refunded their money. Now, nothing I could do about it. I couldn't prove I didn't send him a rock. But if you think about how rare that is, that like if even 2, 3, 4% of people did that, none of it would work anymore. Like credit cards wouldn't work because there's too much fraud. But they don't, because most people would rather build than destroy. So technology is getting better. Most people are good. And finally, those two things together have given us progress in the past. For the last 10,000 years, pretty much everywhere in the world, by every measure, things are better now than they were ever in the past. By any measure, like infant mortality is down and standard of living is up and life expectancy is up and the status of women and individual liberty and self rule and all these other things are going up. So 10,000 years of progress, technology is getting better, and we're basically good people. And that's why I think the future is going to be good.
And you mentioned technology, and you have worked a lot with artificial intelligence, for instance, right? And it's become sort of the buzzword of the times we live in. People tell me that this is the electricity of our times. But there is also a little bit of negativity around it. People are a little bit scared, and you have the entire concept of AI becoming too intelligent, too intelligent for our own good. So should we be worried about our future?
When people say artificial intelligence, it's unfortunate that that term means two very different things, and they get mixed up in the media. So there's one kind of artificial intelligence that we don't know how to make. We call that general intelligence, and that's what you see in the movies. That's Commander Data off Star Trek, that C-3PO from Star
Yeah.
Wars, that's Scarlett Johansson in Her, that's Ex Machina. That's general intelligence, and nobody knows how to make that. Nobody knows how. Everybody would agree with that statement. Nobody knows how to make that. Um, and I used to host an AI podcast, and I would always ask my guests, do you think we're going to get general intelligence? And I asked just over 100 people, and only three said no. And I would be the fourth because I don't believe it's possible. I'm in a minority view on that. I say that, but the reason the 97% believe it's possible is because they have a very simple belief, straightforward belief that people are machines. And if people are machines with general intelligence, then someday we'll build a machine with general intelligence. But I don't believe people are machines. And you don't even have to like go to the soul or anything like that. to have that belief. So that's one kind of AI that I don't believe in. I mean, it's good in the movies, but the other kind of artificial intelligence is something very different, and it's something we know how to do. And we call that narrow intelligence. And it's a pretty simple technology. You take a bunch of data about the past and you study it and you look for patterns in that data. Then you make predictions. And that's how your spam filter can spot spam and how your car can route you through traffic. It's very simple technology. Nobody's afraid of that taking over. But people are afraid they're going to lose their jobs to it. But I don't believe that's possible either. And the reason is that these technologies only do one thing: they increase human productivity. That's it. And if that's bad ever, then maybe we should have laws that require everybody to work with one arm tied behind their back. Because why? You'd need more people to do everything. You would have just created a world of jobs. But because everybody's productivity just fell because they're only working with one arm, their wages would fall. So you create a bunch of low paying jobs by requiring everybody to tie an arm behind their back to work that way. What I like to tell people is, imagine you went back in time 25 years to 1997, the beginning of the consumer internet, and you showed somebody a browser. And you said in the future, billions of people are going to use that. What do you think is going to happen to jobs? And they might have said, wow, this is going to be bad for jobs. All the travel agents are going out of business. The stockbrokers are, because people just do that. The shopping malls are going because people are going to order online. The newspapers are going to go out of business because people get their news online, and on and on. And you know what? They would have been right about everything, everything. But what they would have never said is, oh, there's going to be Airbnb and Uber and Google and Amazon and eBay and Etsy and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and TikTok and all the rest. Because you can't see, it's so easy to see what it's going to destroy, but none of us have the imagination to see what it's going to create. And so we're always looking at one side of the equation. Oh, that's going to be bad. But there's an equal side of it that new productivity enables that we can't perceive, but we have to have faith that it will happen.
So what you just said sort of had me thinking. Is there a possibility of an agora of artificial intelligence? Because then that gets into your general intelligence level, right?
Yes. So I used to raise honeybees as a boy. And, a honeybee is a discreet little animal. And by the way, it's cold blooded, it can't regulate its own body
Yeah.
temperature. Okay. But the bees come together into a beehive. And you can think of the beehive actually as another animal,
Yeah.
a superorganism, as they call it. And interestingly, and superorganisms have characteristics that none of their parts have. Beehives are warm blooded, they maintain a temperature of 97 degrees Fahrenheit, and the bees have to help do that. So you get this creature, this superorganism that's very different than the things that make it up. By the way, you're a superorganism. You have a made up of a bunch of cells. If I took you apart a cell at a time, I could put those cells in petri dishes and they could still live briefly. But you know what? You would vanish, right? Were you ever even there? What were you? What were you? And that you were a superorganism. So could technology come together and create a superorganism? Yes. A man named Kevin Kelly calls it the technium, and believes it behaves like a superorganism. I'm more my this book and my next one are about a human superorganism that I call agora. It's an old Greek word about this noisy marketplace, because I think that's kind of what we are, and that's what I write about. But they aren't incompatible. There can be agora and there can be beehives. Like, the world, I think, is full of nested layers of life, and it exists in all these different kind of levels.
No. You mentioned jobs, and with artificial intelligence, or as you said, narrow intelligence, we are sort of convinced that a lot of the mundane jobs that humans do, can just be hived off to technology, so that all of us can do better things in life. But does that mean that our work itself needs to evolve? Do we really know what we need to do? Is it like again gazing at a crystal ball, because we don't know how we are supposed to work when what we do now can be done by somebody else.
I would say two things to that. One, I often ask audiences to name a job that has been eliminated by technology in the last 5 years. Like if it's going to be the tsunami, like we should be seeing them right and left, right? And I can't name any. And I've spent a lot of time studying this. And I think the half life of a job is 50 years. I think every 50 years, we lose half of all of our jobs. I don't have a sense it's going any faster or slower than that. But how then do we maintain like full employment, which we usually do? And because I think it works like this. Imagine there's a big range of jobs. There's these low pay, low skill jobs, and they're all the way up to these very tech heavy, high paying, high skill, high trained jobs. And people say, truly, that technology eliminates jobs at the bottom, those low paying, low skilled jobs, and they create new ones at the top. And then they ask a question. They say, do you really think those people that used to take orders at a fast food place are going to be able to be geneticists? Are they really going to have the skills for the jobs of tomorrow? And the answer is no, that isn't how it works. What happens is, let's say the new job is a geneticist. Well, that job goes to a college biology professor, university biology professor. And then there's an opening at the university. So the high school biology teacher gets that job. Now there's an opening at the high school. And so a substitute teacher gets hired on to backfill that all the way down the line. So the question isn't, can those people at the bottom do those jobs at the top? The question is, can everybody do a job a little harder than the job they're doing today? I think the answer to that is yes. And if so, you're never going to be obsoleted. You just gradually, you do the same thing to your own career. You look at it and you say, what can I use technology for that I do to destroy stuff I don't want to be doing? And how can I use technology to create me new opportunities? So you think the same way about your own job as happening in the market, and you'll always be seeing how can I use technology to make me more productive. And as long as you're doing that, you have nothing to worry about. I mean, it's 250 years of economic history right there. That's what technology does. Everybody slowly goes up that thing. And that's why we're so much wealthier than when we were farmers, because we have all this technology and we are able to increase our productivity that much that we can make higher wages.
Since we have too much technology maybe in our lives now, is that curve, is that incline of technology sort of gathering pace? Is it getting more of a hockey stick kind of growth, and do we not do we need to prepare ourselves for something like that?
I mean, I'm 53 years old. I was born in that period where I grew up in a world without computers, and I live in a world with them. And I just recall how difficult everything was. Like if I needed to know some fact, it was half a day. I'd go to the library and go to the card catalog and check with the periodicals. And now I type a question in a quarter of a second, I get an answer. I don't remember how we used to make plane reservations and hotel reservations. I don't remember. I mean, all of these things. My life is enriched immensely because technology has been able to enable me to I don't work harder than my grandparents worked, but I live a much more lavish life than they ever lived. Why? Because I deploy technology. An hour of my time yields so much more than an hour of their time. They used to walk down with a bucket and get water from a well. I just turned on a spigot. And I mean, if you were to say, is there any way technology has made our life worse? Probably. But on net, I wouldn't trade it away. I mean, people worry about what would happen if the computers like took over. But the real thing to worry about is what would happen if they stopped working. Like
True.
that's the frightening. That's the frightening dystopia.
So to sum up this fascinating conversation, Byron, what is your vision or thought about the destiny of humanity, as of now?
I think we live in a universe that looks like it's got plenty of room for us in it. That my favorite big universe analogy is that if you take a grain of sand and you put it on the tip of your finger and you hold your finger out as far your arm out as far as you can and you try to find that piece of sand and you can see it, that's blocking your view of 30,000 galaxies. Galaxies. One little speck. And I think that universe is just asking us to come pay a visit. And uh, I think that's our view. Our journey, we've only, that getting language and all of that only happened, I think, about 50,000 years ago. So we're still in the beginnings, and I think we have billions of years ahead of us. So I imagine a day where a billion planets each have a billion people, and they're all empowered to be the best that they can be. Because so much time in our world, there's probably a Mary Curie or a Leonardo da Vinci who's living in some place where survival is a full-time job. They never see any of their potential, and we're all worse off for it. And so I want there to be a billion planets, each with a billion people, and each of whom who can do whatever they want to do. And to me, that's our future. I believe in that.
Thanks a lot for your time, Byron, and it was absolutely fascinating conversation.
Well, I would love to come back, and thank you for having me.
You were listening to Byron Reese, and Our Own Devices is available everywhere you listen to your podcast. Till next week, goodbye.